So let's assume a relatively small project of $10 million, because I can only do math by tens. So let's a $10 million project. The total combined interest and principal payments over 25 years would be $17.5 million. On January 30th, most Canadian banks reported a prime lending rate of 6%. But let's assume for this private contractor, since they're such a good company, that they get to borrow the money at 5.6%, or about 1 percentage point higher than the public borrowing rate. Let's also assume that the company puts up 15% of the money as equity investment and that it expects to get a return of 10%, which is a moderate return on their money. I'm nearly finished with the numbers. So the blended rate on that would be about 6.3% in financing. A total cost of principal and interest over 25 years, assuming a cost of capital of 6.3%, is $21.5 million. That's an additional cost to the project of $4 million on a $10 million project over the life of the project on financing alone. It's an increase in cost of 20%, and I know you can do the math because I'm from Cape Breton and I can do the math. That nowhere in my dictionary spells out value for money.
We know P3s save money, transfer risk, and add great value.
This brings me to the next issue, the public-private partnership, which you will hear all kinds of things about, risk transfer. And risk transfer really is the cornerstone of public-private partnerships. It's the magic pudding that makes everything work. For example, in the case of RB Bennett Bridge in Kelowna, Partnerships BC notes that such risks being transferred as construction, safety materials, you heard cement, fuel, gas, the things that they can't possibly project out going up in price. We certainly get it. But there are a couple of questions that need to be addressed when you're talking about risk transfer. First, would the risk you have transferred to a private company have been transferred anyway under a reasonably well-managed public sector project? And second, just how much are you paying to transfer this risk? So in reality, much of this enormous risk that people talk about, at least in BC, is risk transfer that could and probably would have happened anyway through a design-build contract and a value engineering project. The assumption is made that the public sector is not capable of using what are now traditional methods of protecting citizens. So you may or may not be transferring risk. Is it a good deal? If you listen to P3 proponents, you would get the impression that somehow risk transfer is free. Well, it's not. The price you pay for risk transfer is basically an upfront payment for potential future cost overruns. That's what it really is. And you may be prepared to do that. You may see it as an insurance policy that is worth the price. But you should be aware that you pay a price for it, and that price is very high. You need to know that for sure. The second argument you will hear is that handing a project over to the private sector for 35 years is a good idea because of all of the innovation the private sector will bring to the table. Now, I'm sure everyone in this room has heard that. First of all, overwhelmingly, you can get that innovation through design-build projects that permit creative solutions. Second, the kind of innovation that often comes out is less than you might have defined.
Transfer risk and add great value through design innovations and private sector ingenuity.
For instance, to reduce costs and raise revenues on the rapid transit line being built in Vancouver, the project canceled a station and increased the midday trains. Those remarkable solutions were so innovative that they were not included in the public sector comparator. It appears there's not a single public sector manager that could be creative enough to cancel the construction of a station. So, I've raised some questions about public-private partnerships, but I also want to raise some questions about the people who will be offering to sell us the advice on them. There's about 4 major consulting firms that do almost all of this work. They have offices all over the world, and they are the ones who get called in to provide advice about whether or not to go to P3 for a project. But when you look on the website, you'll discover that they're also the ones who craft the P3s, who put them together. You know, in British Columbia, the lead consulting role on these projects is played by Partnership BC, and I'm sure that many of you heard that term. Their job is to create P3s and get them moving. That's the job of Partnership British Columbia. But they have a bonus system that pays them more, way more, for succeeding with public-private partnerships. Their second job is to advise the government on whether or not a particular P3 is a good idea. And they have a third job. Their third job is deciding whether or not P3s were a good idea after the contract has been signed, so they write their own value for money reports. Again, that bastion of social conscience, the World Bank, thinks it's a conflict of interest. And remember that World Bank has been pushing P3s in countries around this world like nobody would believe. But this is what they had to say about the system in British Columbia, and I quote, "Risks of conflict of interest arise when cross-sectoral 3P units that both provide input into the approval process for 3Ps and play a role in identifying and preparing projects. Conflicts also arise if the 3P unit promotes or assists in developing projects and then is asked to carry out ex post evaluations. The best solution may be to split the functions," unquote. Well, needless to say, there's not a whole lot of function splitting going on here in British Columbia. This conflict of interest, operating right at the top of an organization owned by the British Columbia government, is just a symptom of how accountability and even democratic decision-making have been undermined by public-private partnerships in this province and across the country. And in British Columbia, the government cut funding for the Office of the Auditor General, so that would take care of most of his concerns. When the Auditor General actually asked the government for additional funding to look specifically at P3 projects, he was simply refused. The model we now have for Partnerships BC writing value for money reports on their own projects, and the Auditor General actually gets to review them, only review them. And here's what that Auditor General had to say, who retired last year, and this is what he said in his final report, and I quote, "In the last several years, legislators chose to reduce the extent to which my office could examine government's risk management practices by reducing my funding. I do not understand why legislators chose to restrict my capacity to help them carry out a more rigorous public scrutiny of the performance of government at a time when government was introducing significant change and risk. I think legislators made a mistake," unquote. Let me conclude by saying there is a reason why you hear arguments that the public sector is a failure and that the private sector is a success that have nothing to do with actual management of those public services. First, there is a large group of people who have a vested interest in selling the idea that private sector can do everything better than the public sector. If this idea can be sold to the public, there are absolute billions of dollars to be made, my friends. Second, there are far too few people who are willing to put the argument for the public sector. Elected officials are frequently all too willing to criticize the work of public employees rather than celebrating their accomplishments. I, for one, welcome your skepticism. To politicians and public servants in this room and elsewhere, I say that it is your job to be skeptical in defending the interests of your citizens. But I also want to ask you to exercise the same skepticism when consultants and P3 companies and even higher levels of government try to tell you that letting the private sector finance and operate your public services is the best and only option. Thank you very much.